Hello, U.S. history students, and welcome to the second of three lessons on the Great Depression. Okay, now in this lesson, we're going to review the causes and effects we talked about in the first lesson. We're going to add some more details to it, and we're going to preview the last lesson, which deals specifically on the hardships of the Great Depression. Again, there are no worksheets to fill out. You're going to take your own notes. What I suggest doing with this one is dividing the paper into three sections. Okay, we're going to have a causes section, an events section, and then an effects section, kind of like we did with the last presentation as well. Okay, so that's what we're going to focus on. Again, the causes and effects of the Great Depression. Now, on the causes side, the big cause, the number one cause of the Great Depression, is over speculation on stocks. What happened here, and we talked about in the last lesson, there was buying on the margin. People would borrow money to buy stocks, expecting the stocks to continue to rise. Because remember, we're in the 20s and our economy is doing well. The stock market is growing by leaps and bounds. We expect the stocks to continue to rise, and what people expect to do is someday down the road, they will sell those stocks, they will pay back the loan, okay, and they will have a little bit left over. What ends up happening is the stock market drops, okay, and prices drop, and there's this big sell-off, and people aren't getting as much as they want to out of the stocks. In fact, they're not getting as much as they paid for the stocks, so they can't repay that borrowed money. And when they can't repay that borrowed money, that leads to cause number two, the failure of the Federal Reserve, okay? Banks collapse. Banks end up closing because the banks had loaned out all this money to people to go buy stocks. And now that they can't pay that money back because the stocks aren't making any money or making as much money as that was intended, the banks are closing. And the Federal Reserve, who's supposed to be protecting all this, can't stop it. Okay, we use this idea of a never-ending cycle. Okay, the Federal Reserve can't stop the cycle. It's like a rock at the top of the hill. Okay, they can't stop it. It just goes down the hill and it keeps moving and gets faster and faster and faster as it goes down the hill. One of the things they do is they try to contract the money supply. Okay, with banks closing and with money disappearing, they try to hold back some money in circulation, but that's going to lead to problems as well, because that means people aren't going to be getting as much and earning as much. And if they don't have as much, then they're not going to spend as much. And that's going to lead to problems down the road as well. Okay, so over speculation on stocks leads to bank closings, which leads to the failure of the Federal Reserve. And then to top it all off, we have problems with trading. Okay, there is a protective tariff in 1930, the Hawley-Smoot tariff we talked about in the last presentation. We've talked about this a bunch in this class this year. Protective tariffs are meant as a good thing. You're supposed to protect your industry, okay? You want people to buy American. You make other products more expensive because you increase the import taxes on those other foreign-made products to get people to buy American. The difficulty is you don't want to raise those taxes too much because, and this is what happened in the late 20s and early 30s, we increased the taxes on imports coming from Europe. So Europe increased the taxes on goods coming from us, and that leads to a breakdown on trade between us and Europe at a time when both areas need the money generated from trade. Okay, the taxes become so high in order to protect your own industries that it leads to a breakdown in trade. Okay, and that's going to lead to some problems down the road, which we're going to talk about. By the way, on the quiz for this, okay, remember there's one quiz that covers all of the lessons on the Great Depression. The quiz is going to get you to apply the information. Okay, some of the questions are going to be direct, but a lot of them, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to look at charts and graphs, remember what we talked about, and then apply that information and come up with an answer based on charts and graphs. If you see any chart or graph dealing with the trade levels, okay, or tariff, if it mentions tariffs or imports or anything like that, if you see any charts or graphs dealing with trade, tariffs, or inputs, chances are it's talking about the Hawley-Smoot tariff, okay, and the breakdown of trade. So just a heads up on that before you take the quiz. Now, here's the events, okay? So we got over speculation on stocks, stock market crash. That's going to lead to a failure of banks, which is going to lead to a failure of the Federal Reserve. Then we got problems with trade, okay? Those are our causes. Here's the event. The big event, Black Tuesday, October the 29th, 1929. That's when the stock market falls. Millions of shares of stocks are sold at low prices, below what they cost. That's why people try to sell and get what they can, but then they can't pay back those loans, which causes the banks to fail, which causes the Federal Reserve to fail. This is where the cycle begins. Investors are actually left with a bunch of stock that they cannot sell. Okay. And that's Black Tuesday. That's the day the stock market crashed. All right. That's the key event that is going to start off our depression. And remember, we talked about this as well. Other economies are tied to us. And if something bad happens to us, it's going to impact those economies as well. Okay. So again, never ending cycle. This is what makes it a Great Depression. Banks foreclosed on loans. We talked about that. Loans can't be paid back. The banks run out of money. The banks close. People lose faith in the economy. Okay. They lose faith in the economy. Not only do they not have money to spend, but they begin to fear spending the money that they do have. And that, again, is going to lead to problems down the road, which is where we're headed next when we talk about the effects. Okay. So if you're on your chart, we've talked about the causes. We've mentioned the event. Okay. The event is the stock market crash. And now here we go on the effects. First effect, and again, in no particular order. First effect, investors lose money. Okay. People invested money in banks. Well, people invested in stock, expecting the stock to continue to rise. The market drops. The stocks lose in value. People who have all this money tied up in the stock market are going to lose. Okay. They're not going to get their money back. They're not going to be able to pay back the loans to the banks. The banks are going to fail, and the Federal Reserve is going to fail. Again, cycle. Okay. You could see here, income drops to 40%. Many investors lose everything on the stock market. Okay. And there are some investors that end up committing suicide because they've lost everything. And not only have they lost their own money, but they lost other people's money as well. And they just can't handle it. Okay. And they end up taking their lives. I mean, there are stories of people in New York. New York was where the stock market is, big financial district in New York. New York's got a lot of tall buildings. These investors go up to the top floor and just walk off the side of the building. Okay. Because they're so distraught at losing their income and losing other people's income. Financial collapse. We talked about this. Your stocks lose value. You can't pay back the loans. The banks have loaned all this money. They can't get this money back. And now the banks are closing. Okay. And the Federal Reserve fails to prevent this widespread collapse of the banking system, which leads to a contraction in the nation's supply of money in circulation. You don't have to write that down. That's what was already in the effect or already in the cause section. Okay. But this picture shows a run on the bank as people head to the bank to try to get out what money they have. Okay. They know banks don't have money because they've loaned it all out. They know the Federal Reserve is contracting the money supply. So people rush the banks to try to get any money they can out of their accounts. Now, here's the big thing. Everything kind of points to this: unemployment, businesses and factories close. When people lose money in the market, they don't have money to spend. When banks close and people can't get their money out and the money supply contracts, people don't have money to spend. When people lose faith in the economy and they want to hold on to the money they have and they don't spend that money, that's going to cause businesses to lay off workers or cut back production. When businesses lay off workers or cut back production, people are going to be out of work, which means they're not going to have money to spend. People are going to be making less money, which means they don't have money to spend. Once again, it's a never-ending cycle, okay? Everything has been kind of pointing to this major problem. 86,000 businesses fail, and about 13 million workers are left unemployed. The highest rate of unemployment during the Great Depression is 25%, okay? which, and you can see that's in 1933. You want to run a little unemployment, okay, but not a quarter of the population or a quarter of the working population. And we've talked about this. People wanted to work. They were desperate for any type of employment. So you see here this line outside this unemployment agency, and we talked about people moving across country, hearing that there are jobs in other locations, and people want those jobs. So people want to work. It's very, very frustrating that they are unemployed. Local missions, local churches are going to sponsor soup kitchens, bread lines to try to feed the unemployed and help the unemployed. Right? So we see food line or bread lines and soup kitchens and food banks opening up to try to help people. There's a line. Notice free coffee and donuts for the unemployed. Okay, but there's a big line outside this building waiting for that free soup, that free bread, those free coffee and donuts. If we had more time, okay, an interesting project would be to talk about what the psychological state of the nation is. What is this massive unemployment doing to the psychological state of the nation? The fact that people want to work and they can't. How does that make people feel? Well, we see an increase in shame. We see an increase in depression. We see an increase in hopelessness. And in some cases, that's going to lead to an increase in suicide, because the people are getting frustrated. They want to work. They want to take care of their family. There are all these problems. There are all these cycles. Nothing seems to be able to break the cycle. The president is not being able to help. The Federal Reserve is not being able to help. It just leads people to feel down, and sometimes they're going to take the only way out they think they have, and that is suicide. All right. So another part here, it's not mentioned here on the screen, but another part is suicide rates increase. Another major problem, home foreclosures, farm foreclosures, okay? And that's going to lead to homelessness. If you don't have money, you can't pay the rent, you can't pay the mortgage, all right? The group that seems to be hit the worst are farmers. New machinery has caused crop increases. Farmers are able to produce more at this point in time. But sadly, because they have this surplus of crops now and nobody can buy it because everybody is losing money or out of work or something along those lines, they have these surpluses of food, which means crop prices are really, really low. And since the farmers aren't making money by selling their crops, they can't pay for their farms or their houses, and banks foreclose on the mortgages, or tenants find or landlords find another renter or something like that, okay? Farmers seem to be hit the worst. And on top of it, all right, not only are they having economic problems, but there are actually physical weather problems as well that we can see here in this photograph, all right? It's very, very dry. The Midwest is suffering from something called the Dust Bowl, okay? 1933 to 1934. Not only do we have all these economic problems, but we got this physical problem. All these dust storms are destroying the Great Plains, all this farmland out in the Midwest, okay? And so farmers are hit doubly hard. In some respects, they got a surplus of crops and they can't sell it. But in some respects, the weather is killing the crops that they do have, okay? And again, it's going to lead to loss of farms, loss of homes, foreclosures, et cetera, et cetera. There's some pictures. This is a dust storm in Oklahoma. There's one coming over this looks like a little, a well-constructed neighborhood. But don't forget, people that are homeless, they construct these neighborhoods out of neighborhoods of shacks that they call Hoovervilles after President Hoover, because they blame him for the Depression. So it kind of looks like this dust storm is heading toward one of these Hoovervilles, although that now that I look at those houses look better than just your average run-of-the-mill shacks, okay? There's something called dust pneumonia. I mean, you can see in this picture, look at this is a car. Look at how much the dust has piled up there. Okay. Same thing. These guys are heading toward a shed out in the back. Notice the dust is up to the door. Okay. It's almost like snow. It's like you're being buried in a snowstorm of dust. And people that are caught out there develop a condition called dust pneumonia, because that dust gets into your nose and into your lungs and causes difficulty breathing. Okay. So it is a very, very difficult time for farmers during this point, during the 30s. 25% of farmers are going to migrate out of the Dust Bowl. They're going to head to places like California. I told you about the Joad family in Grapes of Wrath. Okay, they're looking for jobs in California because their farms in the Midwest are suffering during the Great Depression. And then last but not least, political unrest and the growth of labor unions. Okay, people are upset with the Federal Reserve. People are upset with the President Hoover, for not doing more to try to stop this. And because they blame these groups and they blame these people, they blame politicians for this, that's going to lead to political unrest. We also see a resurgence in labor unions. The idea that these unions are going to fight to protect the workers or protect the farmers during tough times like this. All right, that's another effect of this Great Depression. Well, that's it for this presentation, okay? Be sure you review this. Be sure you review the previous presentation. Don't forget to look at the third presentation, but review all that material before you take your final quiz on the